everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. My name is Bernadette Stadler, and I'm a Herbert Scovel Junior Peace Fellow here at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. We're lucky to have here with us tonight Dr. Jim Walsh, an expert in international security at MIT and a longtime center contributor. He's one of the foremost experts on North Korea, and one of the few Americans who's actually been to North Korea to participate in dialogue on their nuclear program. Today I'm going to be asking Dr. Walsh some questions that will hopefully give us all a better understanding of the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So to start off, I'd like to ask you, why have we been hearing so much about North Korea in the news lately?
Well, before I do that, let me thank you, Bernadette, and thank the Center for all the great work you do, and for creating this opportunity for me to talk to a lot of people I've probably never met before. And you should know that immediately after doing this event with you, we're walking across the way, and I'm going over to Capitol Hill to meet with the members of Congress, senators and representatives, and we're going to do the same thing over there, but you get first dibs. So, now, the question, why so much in the news? Well, part of it is that North Korea calls attention to itself. We all know missile tests. There were something like 26 different missile tests last year. Nuclear tests, there were 2 of those last year. In fact, the whole pace of testing has increased over this last year, and in particular since the young Mr. Kim has taken power over from his father. And, you know, other sorts of activity like assassinating a half-brother with VX nerve agent, holding some Malaysian citizens essentially hostage. That'll get you in the news if you do that.
So you mentioned some of the tests that have occurred over the past year. Could you talk to a little bit about exactly how advanced North Korea's nuclear and missile programs are?
Well, I think a couple of things about, you know, where are these programs? First of all, the emphasis should be on the plural, programs. They have lots of different missile programs. There are short-range missiles, medium-range missiles, intermediate-range missiles, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. So at least 4 different types of missiles, and then they come land-based or sea-launched out of a submarine. Now, you have a collection of missile programs. Not all of them are equally advanced. Not all of them are making progress as quickly as the others. So one that people talk a lot about, for example, is the so-called Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, the ICBM. This is a world filled with acronyms. And people worry about that because they think what that really means is that North Korea at some point would have the ability to launch a missile halfway around the globe and hit the U.S. homeland. I don't think that's progressing very quickly. They haven't done the sort of tests you would need to do to be able to do that. But they continue to make progress in moving from liquid fuels to solid fuels in their medium and intermediate range missiles. There's no doubt, you know, sometimes it's 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. A lot of these tests have failed, but even in failure, you learn something. So I think that particularly in the intermediate range missile and with their submarine launch missiles, they have made progress.
So one of those news events that we referenced at the top actually was the launch of 4 missiles. This was in early March, and they ended up landing in the ocean off the coast of Japan.
Yeah.
Could you give a little bit of context for that event and talk about what it means?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all want to know, is what does this mean? And unfortunately, this is very hard to answer, because North Korea is the most opaque country in the world. We know less about North Korea than any other country, and half the things they say aren't true. They make grand pronouncements about accomplishments that are in fact false, fake news as it were. You know, they've claimed that they have a hydrogen bomb. I have significant doubts whether they've been able to do that. So you have sort of misinformation and a lack of transparency, so it's really hard to know. We can guess. So part of it, I would say, there's some good old regular explanations that you can certainly fill in this case. The first is that right now the U.S. and South Korea are engaged in a massive military exercise. They do this every year, and almost every year that South Korea and the U.S. do that, there's some sort of missile test or provocation, something that expresses North Korea's displeasure. But then again, as I said, Bernadette, the North Koreans, they conducted 24 missile tests or 26 missile tests, you know, so they're going to conduct missile tests. This is partly just a continuation of, you know, what they've been doing for a while. So in some ways, you know, no news there, and that's what they're all about. You know, I would say if you want to get into a more speculative domain, there's been a lot of talk about the U.S. Installing missile defense in South Korea to counter North Korea's missiles. And some have suggested, as a possibility, that this was a missile test where they shot 5 missiles all at once. One failed, the other 4 succeeded. That by testing a multiple missile launcher, that was their way of sending a little message of, well, if you build missile defenses, we're going to build more missiles and overwhelm your missile defenses.
So jumping off of that point about that, the missile defense system that has just recently, the first components of it have arrived in South Korea. How exactly does that system work, very basically, and will it actually be helpful for South Korea's security?
Well, the way THAAD is supposed to work is you fire this one missile, and it goes up towards the other missile. When the enemy missile sort of reaches its apex, the missile that we shoot crashes into the incoming missile and knocks it off course. Where it goes is another question, but it is supposed to go off course. Now, we've had this system since 1995. Has it ever been used in time of conflict? No. I tend to be a skeptic when it comes to missile defense. I think it's really, really hard to do, and I think it has some really nasty unintended consequences, like it can make war more likely rather than less likely. But in any case, that's what we're putting in there. I mentioned before, there are lots of different missiles, and we tend to put them all in one bucket and make generalizations. Same thing with missile defense. Missile defenses tend to be very missile specific. So this was really built to try to defeat Scuds, the old Russian system that proliferated to Iraq and elsewhere. And so it's not really relevant, for example, if North Korea develops sea-launched ballistic missiles. So it's a specific system aimed at a specific type of missile, and I think with great uncertainty about what would happen if we ever actually got into a shooting war. So why do I say that? I'm not saying, again, I'm not a fan of THAAD, but if you want to reassure your allies, that's great. But if you're thinking that missile defense is going to save your butt, that we can do whatever we want, make whatever mistakes that can be made, and in the end, missile defense is going to save us, you're barking up the wrong tree. We better not have to depend on THAAD to save us if there's a crisis.
Great, that's uplifting.
And what day is today? Monday. I'm starting the week off.
Well, we always cross our fingers when we leave the office and hope that North Korea won't do something provocative over the weekend. So moving to another piece of news that we've encountered in the past couple of weeks. Last week, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was in Asia, and he made some comments about U.S. policy towards North Korea while he was there.
Yeah.
Specifically, he said that the U.S. will not negotiate with North Korea about its nuclear programs until they get rid of their nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And he also emphasized that all options, including the military option, are on the table for the U.S.
Yes.
So what are the implications of his comments for any resolution to the situation on this?
Well, I think it's sort of a mess. So if I understand him correctly, all options are on the table except diplomacy. I think that means all options aren't on the table if you're taking one option off before having even tried it. There was a great graphic in the Washington Post recently, in the last couple of months, and it showed all the missile tests sort of in a bar chart, naturally in the form of missiles, since 1997, I think, through 2017. And what you see when you look at this chart, it makes the reality and the history crystal clear. You see that once Kim Jong-un, the young Kim, came to office, man, the tests just go off the charts. Lots and lots of testing. Clearly, we're dealing with a different situation than we did under his father. But the other thing you notice about the chart is there are all these tests, and then there's this period from like 1998 to 2005 where there's virtually nothing happening. And that was the agreed framework. That was during the period when we had a negotiated agreement with North Korea, ending their reactor that produces nuclear materials for nuclear weapons and ending long-range missile tests. Now that eventually died under the George W. Bush administration. But it's striking to see the only point in which there's not problems and trouble is the period where we actually had a negotiated framework in place. My own view, having spent 15 years on this and been to North Korea and spent lots of time with North Koreans, is the North Koreans are better behaved when they're in the tent. When they're outside of the tent, they are much more likely to cause problems and throw sticks and stones. When they're in the tent, it's not easy, but I would take a freeze in a heartbeat over our current situation, which is more and more tests, more and more capable weapon systems.
And if we're talking negotiations, we also have to include another player in the region, which of course is China.
Yes.
So China has been keeping an eye on North Korea the same way that we do, and one of the things that they've mentioned over and over again is that they oppose our deployment of THAAD in
Yes.
South Korea. Could you talk a little bit about the dynamics of including China in whatever's going on in the region?
Yeah, well, first things first. There's no solving this problem without China. So let me repeat that. There is no solving this problem without China. If China and the U.S. can't cooperate, then this thing continues and gets worse. So the question is, how do we get Chinese cooperation? Now, the traditional view here in the beloved city of Washington, D.C., which I'm not a resident, is, well, we should threaten the Chinese. That's a good way to get them to cooperate, is if we threaten them. I know that doesn't work well in my own household. Deterrence is one thing. You hit me, I'll hit you back. That's pretty crystal clear, pretty doable in the nuclear age, not perfect, and thus, why we're all talking about this, but relatively easier. Then there's this thing called compellence, where you force people to do what you want them to do. That's much harder than deterrence, and often gets confused for deterrence. And then there's this third thing, which is what everyone is talking about now, which is we're going to force people to cooperate with us by threatening them. I think that's going to be really hard. The Chinese, truth be told, the Chinese hate the North Koreans, and the North Koreans hate the Chinese. That's just the way it is. And the North Koreans cause all sorts of problems for China. It makes them look weak when China tells them not to test and they do it anyway. Not very good PR for a rising world power. All these tests cause hawks in Japan and North Korea to start talking about nuclear weapons. China doesn't want that. It brings the U.S. deeper in the region. China doesn't want that. Terrible, terrible, terrible. The only thing worse for China than all those things is a failed nuclear weapon state on its border. Imagine if Mexico had nuclear weapons. That would be, we would worry about that. We would not want that to happen. And that's how the Chinese feel. And in particular, not only because it's a threat to them, but it's a dagger to their most important vital interest. China's most important vital interest is economic growth so that they can have social stability and hold on to power. Chinese communists want to hold on to power, and they see economic growth as a way to manage all these poor people on this economic transition they're making. Well, if North Korea fails from squeezing them too hard, then those three provinces, Chinese provinces that are next to North Korea, they're in trouble. Not to mention waves of refugees. So we have to recognize that China has some legitimate interests here, and we have to find a way, other than lecturing them and waving our finger at them, to be able to find where we can act cooperatively. Because again, for the third time, there is no solving this problem without China.
All right, and I only have one last question for you before we turn it over to questions from the viewers, which you can submit by typing them into the comment box below the video. So my last question for you, which is the question we wish everyone else had already solved, so you don't have to answer it, is what do you think the best strategy is to deal with North Korea?
Well, good. I'm not going to answer that question since you gave me an out. Well, I think, I'm not a big fan of this phrase, all options on the table, but in this case, I believe that's where we have to go. And by that, I mean we have to start talking to the North Koreans. If only, even if we don't get anything done, let's say there's no grand agreement which makes everyone happy, we should be talking to them rather than not talking to them. Because if there is a crisis, or if there is a problem, this could escalate very, very quickly. And what we have in the region, I've been at this for 15 years, is I'm not one of these threat hypers. I don't want to say, fear, 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 fear. But I do have to say that things are at a particularly delicate moment right now. And by that I mean everyone in the region is at each other's throats, or at least angry with one another. What do I mean? The Chinese are mad at the North Koreans. The North Koreans are mad at the Chinese. The South Koreans are mad at the Chinese, and the Chinese are mad at the South Koreans. The South Koreans are mad at the Japanese, and the U.S. is mad at China. In other words, North Korea is fairly isolated. It's not talking to a lot of people. It has a leader, that could easily miscalculate or misperceive a situation. In those circumstances, you want countries talking to each other and to avoid uncertainties and errors. And so one of the first things I do, whether it was towards a nuclear agreement or not, is reestablish communication to begin to see if we can avoid at least the worst possibilities by talking to one another.
All right, with that, we'll turn it over to questions from viewers.
Sure. So we'll start with one. I'm going to spin it off from the original question, but if North Korea ever got an ICBM capability and it was fired at the United States, does the United States have any way of actually neutralizing that threat once it's been launched?
Well, it would depend on the particulars of the missile system, but I think in general, as I said before, as I travel around the country and give lectures and even talking to media people, I get the sense that people think we have sort of like this magic system that can defend us, defend against nuclear weapons. And I think part of it is we've been talking about missile defense since Ronald Reagan, long before you were probably born. And we've talked about it for so much. I think people have come to sort of believe that we have it, and we don't. And let's say you shoot down one missile. Let's say 90%, you shoot down 90% of the missiles, and they shoot 100 missiles. Well, that's 10 U.S. cities. So what happens when you take out New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Atlanta, 10 cities? So we hit 90%. You know, that's not a defense.
Okay. And you mentioned before about the 1994 agreed framework that the United States and other countries negotiated with North Korea. Why did that framework fail? You mentioned that the Bush administration, it didn't follow through, but what exactly happened? Because sometimes opponents of diplomacy often argue that that's the quintessential example of why diplomacy doesn't work.
Well, I would say, first of all, there are I can give you lots of examples where diplomacy works. The Iran nuclear agreement only being the most recent. But I thought the agreed framework did work. It worked for as long as all the countries abided by it. And as I said, you know, I'd switch what we got now, lots of missile tests and nuclear tests, for a situation where there are no missile tests and no nuclear tests. I'd switch that up in a heartbeat. So I think what we're under now is a worse situation. Now, the agreed framework, I think it was a combination. It was both, you had a new administration, in this case the George W. Bush administration, that was hostile to President Clinton's diplomacy. This is Bill Clinton's diplomacy back in the day in the 1990s. They came in with a view that you don't talk to evil, you defeat it, which, you know, that sounds great until, you know, someone has a nuclear weapon, or, you know, it sounds better than it works out in practice. Just take my word for that. So you had an administration that was very hostile towards the agreement to begin with, was looking for an excuse to get out of it. We ran into problems where we were not fulfilling our obligations. We were supposed to build them a light water reactor. We did not do that. They were doing things that they were not supposed to do. They were exploring with their plutonium reactors shut down. They were looking at ways to get enrichment technology, which would be another way, an alternative route to produce nuclear materials. And so it was starting to fray, and certainly confidence between George Bush, United States, and Kim Jong-il, North Korea. Confidence was a sinking asset, deteriorating asset. So actions by both countries, and then eventually the U.S. just pulled out.
Okay. So another question we have is about North Korea's nuclear tests. And as you know, Jim, very well, we've had 5 North Korean nuclear tests in their history. Would you wager that there's another nuclear test possible within the next 3 months? And how easy is it at this point in North Korea's nuclear development to be able to test at virtually any time?
Now, do I get paid extra money if I'm right on my predictions?
I think you do.
Okay, good. That helps. That'll incentivize me. Well, you know, every day there's some newspaper report that North Korea is going to test. And this has sort of turned into a big game where there'll be activity at a test site, and then there'll be newspaper reports. And then, are they going to do it, or are they not going to do it? All I know is that, you know, last year they had a nuclear test, 2 nuclear tests. So if they had 2 last year, I'm guessing they'll probably do 1 this year. When, you know, is it the next 3 months? Is it the next 9 months? You can make a case for it almost on any calendar day. You know, it's someone's birthday, or it's some North Korea holiday, or it's U.S. and South Korea are doing bad things. You know, they can find a day in the calendar if they want to do it. When, I don't know, but I expect, I see no reason right now, I see no reason why they would stop testing. And I think that's the question to ask, is not will they not when will the next test be, because it could happen anytime. But what's different today that would lead them to a different conclusion, that would lead them to forego having a nuclear test? I think that's really what our policy has to be aimed at, and what our creative thinking has to be aimed at.
And so another question, you mentioned potential for negotiations that would lead to a nuclear freeze. In the past, the negotiations always would have led to, in theory, a denuclearized Korean peninsula.
Yeah.
Do you think that's possible at this point?
Yeah, I do. I'm probably a minority analyst on this. I think everyone sort of comes to the conclusion, oh my God, they've built all this nuclear stuff, they're never going to give it up, it's impossible. I'd say one of the only upsides of dealing with a one-person dictatorship is that if the one person changes his or her mind, then policy can change like that. I've heard the North Koreans over 15 years take every conceivable position about their nuclear weapons. That they'll give them up, that they'll keep them, but they won't export to others, that they'll be a responsible nuclear state, they'll have no first use, I've heard it all. So I don't, and given that this is a government that shows the capacity to do almost anything, I'm not prepared to say, well, this is a done deal, they're never going to give them up. When it comes to North Korea, I never say never, because all things are possible, good and bad. So I think what we have to do is keep working at creating that as a possibility. If we give up on that as a possibility, we may miss an opportunity to turn this around. So I say, let's not prejudge it. There's no need to prejudge it. And instead, let's create the conditions that we can put this in a different direction.
Got another question here. So oftentimes in Washington, we'll hear after North Korea's nuclear tests, or they'll test a new ballistic missile capability, we'll hear the same old status quo, which is condemnation and a call to ratchet up sanctions.
Right.
You put out a report last year with a colleague at Harvard explaining why the sanctions regime that we have now isn't fully living up to its potential. Could you explain simplistically why the current sanctions aren't exactly being implemented in the way that they were intended?
Sure. Well, for this study, John Park and I went and interviewed North Korean defectors who have moved to South Korea, and in their old job used to work for North Korean state trading companies. These are the very entities whose job is to evade sanctions and to procure illicit goods for the North Koreans. And I think the bottom line, echoed, by the way, in a recent UN report that was just released this past month, is that, if you're an old school security studies person, you know that the enemy gets a vote. You can do everything you want, but they get to respond. And what the North Koreans have done in the face of sanctions is they've innovated. They come up with countermeasures. So we say they can't buy X, Y, and Z. What do? They move into China and hire private Chinese middlemen to do all their procurement for them. So you're a European firm who set up a company in China building widgets, and you get an order from another Chinese company, and you say, oh, that looks fine. So you sell them your widgets, not knowing that this Chinese company is actually doing procurement on behalf of North Korea. So we tend to do sort of things one time, that was great, offer ourselves congratulations and move on. And what's happening is this is a dynamic, iterative, two-level game where we do something and then they respond, and then really what we should be doing is responding to their innovations. And also taking advantage of the fact that when they do innovate, that creates new vulnerabilities as well as strengths for them. But we tend not to do that. We tend to sing the same verse a little louder.
And sticking with sanctions, China recently announced that they would block North Korea's coal exports to the country, which is a major source of income for Pyongyang. How does that actually play out this year? And is this actually a big development, or do you see the Chinese going back to the status quo?
Further, I have to say to you out there, you have entered a deeply wonky conversation. And it's to your credit that you're actually still listening. I'm surprised.
We're doing a good job
I'm surprised.
debunking it
Exactly.
as much as possible.
So now we're on to Korean coal caps. Some background there. You'll remember I said to you earlier that China is not going to want to squeeze North Korea so much that it collapses, because that cost would be worse than anything else that it could possibly face, given its own national interests. Still, as I also said, China hates what North Korea is doing. So it's trying to thread this needle. And one of the things it's done, to my surprise and the surprise of other analysts, is it signed off onto this UN Security Council resolution from early last year that committed countries to reduce coal and iron ore exports to North Korea. Now, that was implemented in 2016. The 2016 numbers say that China really didn't cut back on its coal imports. It actually increased its coal imports over 2015. But I think everyone was struck by this recent announcement that that they were going to cap it as of February or whatever. And I think what this does is it gives the Chinese some leverage. If the North Koreans act more responsibly, enter six-party talks, maybe cut down on some of the testing, then I can see China sort of pulling back on that cap commitment and loosening the spigot and allowing more imports from North Korea. If things go downhill, then they can follow through and enforce it. So I think in some ways we don't know what the future is, and this is right now the Chinese have their hand on the spigot and are going to wait and decide whether to let those exports increase or not, depending on how the North Koreans behave and what happens in the U.S.-Chinese political relationship. If that goes to hell, then that has implications for what China will do as well.
Okay, so we'll do a non-wonky question. The South Korean elections that are coming up soon, how will that potentially impact the relationship with the North and its relationship with the United States?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. The first thing to realize is that election isn't until, I think, May 9th. So we all have gone through this U.S. election. We had an election in November. We had an inauguration in January. Many positions remain unfilled. The new president's getting his sea legs, I hope. And so, that same process is going to happen with the South Koreans. They're going to elect someone. They're not going to be ready to go on day one. They're going to need time to pull their national security team together, to do a policy review, and to decide what they're going to do. Now, some observers are suggesting that the progressive candidate, after more than 8 years, 12 years of rule by conservatives in South Korea, that the electorate may turn to a progressive, and one person in particular, according to the polls. If that person were to win, and we're a long way off of that, but if that person were to win, he would be coming in with a policy that is much more pro-engagement, a softer policy line vis-a-vis North Korea, at a time when, at least by rhetoric, the U.S. president has a rather tough line on North Korea. So that's going to be something to watch. If South Korea is moving in one direction and the U.S. is moving in another direction, I think that's a fraught situation. We can't solve this problem without China. I said that before. But equally important is that the U.S. and North Korea act together as one team on this. And if they're split and not communicating, or the left hand is doing one thing and the right hand is doing something else, that's going to cause all sorts of problems.
Just to clarify, I think you meant the U.S. and South Korea there.
Yes. So if the allies of U.S. and South Korea, if the U.S. does one thing and South Korea does something else, that's going to complicate things, at best, complicate things. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm certainly urging current policymakers to take their time. The current president doesn't like Obama's policy of strategic patience, and I was actually not a fan of strategic patience myself. But I would not replace it with a policy of strategic haste. Haste in this case, in this region at this time, not a good idea. So I hope that the U.S. waits for that election to happen, doesn't go off half-cocked and do something stupid, and then works with our allies on a policy that they can pursue together closely. That's what I hope, but hard to say. A lot of things could happen between now and then.
So final question, what can those who are watching at home do about the North Korean situation? Can they contact their members of Congress? How can they influence it positively to make sure that the United States and their families are safe?
Well, I think what you're doing right now is one small and important step to that, which is learn a little bit more about what's going on here. Because if, I don't have to tell you, there's a lot of myth and misinformation out in the news. And it's not in the news, it's websites making all sorts absurd claims. Sometimes it's the U.S. government making absurd claims. And so I think understanding a little bit more about this, and that it's just not black and white, and that there are some dangers here. And the danger isn't that North Korea wants to kill us, or even that we want to kill North Korea. The real danger is something small happens, people make mistakes, and it escalates. And so learning more about it, reaching out to your congressperson, letting them know that you're concerned about the danger there. This thing, that something small could get out of control quite quickly, and that we have thousands of U.S. troops there. If you're a family member of someone who's stationed overseas, then you should be communicating that to the White House and Congress, that your family members or friends or loved ones are over and they're on the front line here. And if people mess this up, our soldiers are going to be in harm's way. So I think learning more and communicating to members of Congress this message of let's work with our allies, let's not move in haste, let's explore all the options, just not the military options. Those are at least some of the things that individuals can do. But you're off to a great start. If you can sit through this, you can probably do anything.
Well, that wraps it up, I think. Thank you so much for a very enlightening discussion of what's going on in North Korea. I hope that all the viewers enjoyed this, and if you did enjoy this brief presentation, please follow us on Facebook, and you'll be able to get access to more of them in the future.